close to the old St. Elizabeth's Hospital. And I was a privileged guy because I got to build a fire in the stove during the winter. And I stayed there and lived there until we went to Prescott School. That was for the sixth, seventh, and eighth grades. And then we were the first ninth grade to go to Lincoln High. And then they eliminated that, and now we're back again to the ninth grades going to Lincoln High. When I was at Lincoln High, I was active in the orchestra. I played the violin, and I'd taken lessons till I was 7, from the time I was 7. Got to be pretty good. I was a concertmeister of our national championship orchestra. And well, I was active in the acting. I did a couple shows at the high school, and then I went to the University of Nebraska, into the engineering college, but I wasn't suited for engineering. So I really didn't do well, and I didn't have very good advice either. But I was very active in the military. I loved the military, and ROTC to me was a pleasure. And then I got married in 1934 and went to Salina, Kansas, and had a little junk shop there and did well. And of course, then Joe and Gary were born at Asbury Hospital. As a matter of fact, I delivered Gary because the doctor didn't show up and there was no nurses in the room. And my wife said, "Here it comes," and there he came. But he was crying and urinating, so I knew everything was all right, and I just lifted him out. And then the nurses came, and the doctor never charged me. But it was the charge if I had to pay was $25. Then in 1941, I was called to active duty for 1 year, supposedly, and went out to Matherfield, California. And when I saw all the cadets there, I called my wife and I said, "This is going to be longer," because I had a feeling that something was going to happen. So then she and the kids joined me out there. But then I was transferred to Matherfield, California. I mean, from Matherfield to Williamsfield. At that time, it was Higley Field, and they were just building it. And I was transferred there as a squadron commander. At that time, I was a first lieutenant. Eventually became a major, and then had a chance to go overseas, which I wanted to do very badly, because being Jewish and Hitler, I wanted to have part of it. But when I got to Salt Lake City, they put me into a glider outfit and sent me to Boise, Idaho, where incidentally they had a little building for a synagogue, and I got them together and conducted the first service in Boise, Idaho at that synagogue. Incidentally, let's back up a little bit. Let's talk about my dad and my mother, because my dad went into business in 1906 and prospered and was a terrific businessman and built the business into one of the largest scrap operations in this whole area. We were very friendly with the Fears, for instance, in Omaha, and the Fleischmans. I don't know if you got them in the history, but, and gosh, I can't remember some names. Anyway, prominent Omaha people. And my dad came from Kiev in the Ukraine, and my mother came from Lithuania, and she came to Omaha. My dad came to Lincoln because he had some cousins here. And my mother was a Grossman. Now that name is familiar because of Lena and Morris Grossman and Leo Meyerson and that crew. So we're kind of related. I don't remember now. You want to cut it a second?
No, I'd like to hear some more about your mother and dad.
Well, that's what I'm trying to remember. Because my dad then was president of our synagogue, and we were one of the first conservative synagogues in America. And that's where I was bar mitzvah. And I was the first bar mitzvah in Lincoln. And that was, of course, 1926. And that was a big deal. The Gentile people didn't even know what we were talking about in those days. Now, of course, they're more familiar. My dad was very progressive. He was a socialist in Russia. And that's why he had to get out of there, because it was a precarious thing to be in under the communists. But he ran for the Senate as a socialist. And some of the things he advocated are now Social Security, health insurance, unemployment insurance, and all of those things that Roosevelt came into. He was very fond of President Roosevelt, and they corresponded to each other. And when Roosevelt died, my dad went to bed. He was so upset.
Where did your mother and dad meet?
They met in Omaha through the Fleischman family. I don't know if anyone remembers the Fleischmans, but they were a fine family in Omaha. And that's how they met. And then my mother came to Lincoln because her brothers were here in Lincoln. Charlie Grossman, Nathan Grossman, and Morris Grossman. Later, Nathan and Morris Grossman went to Manhattan, Kansas and opened a store. And then I think after their kids started growing up, Morris went to Council Bluffs to the Grossman department store, and Nathan stayed in Lincoln, and he went into business also. See, where were we?
Let's talk a little bit about your business, when you became involved with your father's business.
I always loved the scrap business. I grew up in it. I went to work there without pay when I was, 7 or 8 years old, doing whatever it was. And then, of course, as I got older, I became more interested and worked there during the summers sometimes. Sometimes when I didn't work there, I think when I was about 16, one summer I was a messenger boy for Western Union when we used to deliver telegrams on our bicycle. And later when I got into school, I sold shoes on O Street, Hub Clothing I think it was. They're no longer in existence, of course. And then of course, during some of the years I was in school, I had taken chemistry, so I did analysis for Northwestern when we were making type metal. That's for the newspapers. And at that time I used to sell the type metal to the Lincoln Star and the Nebraska Farmer and other places. Then when I got married, of course they sent me down to Salina. They had a branch there, and I took that over. While in Salina, I became a mason and a Shriner, and I belonged to Kiwanis. And with our Kiwanis Club, we organized the first midget baseball. I don't care what they say about Pennsylvania or wherever it is. It happened in Salina because a grocer and I decided the number of feet to first base and how many feet for the pitcher. We did this because Salina had what they called the Ben Johnson Baseball League, and Salina won the national championship. Now that later became the American Legion Baseball. But then our midget was curtailed when I was in the service. I did have 2 or 3 boys from my midget team that made the majors. One was Bobby Kane, who later pitched for Detroit. And then my catcher was a fellow by the name of Swift, who became the manager of the St. Louis Browns. And that was all very interesting because I visited with them later. Getting back to military. After I was put in with the glider outfit and stationed in Sioux City for a while, well, that would be interesting because I was a troubleshooter later after they disbanded our glider outfit, thank God, because we were training for the invasion of China. And if that had taken place, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you. But while I was in St. Louis, in Sioux City, with my outfit, I'd complained about the mess hall. I said it was filthy and I didn't want my boys eating there, so we put up our own mess camp. Well, after I was dismissed from the glider outfit from Wendover, Utah, and sent to Sioux City, the General Cousins of the 2nd Air Force had remembered about my complaint. So he says, put him in charge of the mess hall and let him straighten it out, which I did. And of interest, of course, I got acquainted with the Friedman family, Abe Friedman and the twins, and Dorothy and Helen from Omaha. And when we had chicken at the mess hall, I would save the fat and take it into Sioux City so they could make the fat out of it. Schmaltz. Yeah. But we were very active in Sioux City while I was stationed there. And then, of course, the next thing they put me into was we had black outfits separated, so I became their commanding officer. And the interesting thing about that is that in our mess hall, where Betty and the kids and I used to go once in a while, our mess sergeant had been the maitre d' at Antoine's in Los Angeles, and my salad guys had also come from that same kitchen, so we ate like kings. Well, then we got them squared away, and they sent me to Rapid City, South Dakota, with another black outfit. That outfit couldn't go into Rapid City. They were not allowed off the base. And I finally got the senator to move them to another place. I used to give them passes so they could go into Sioux City or Denver or Kansas City once in a while. And they were wonderful. My first sergeant was a PhD from Princeton. These things are hard to believe, but they were treated like, I don't know, they were allowed to wash the airplanes or drive the trucks or pick up the garbage. And that was it. But one thing we were, because I was ex-infantry, we became the best marching squadron on the base and showed them every time we had a parade or an inspection. Well, then I suddenly got oh, by the way, while I was at Williams Field in Arizona and again at Rapid City, I produced Army shows that we showed downtown. And we sold war bonds for admission and raised a lot of money. And of course, the talent in the service at that time was unbelievable. I had people from all the leading orchestras, dance orchestras, and professors and teachers who were chorus directors. And we had wonderful shows. Well, then I was transferred to Vandalia, Ohio, to the contract termination, because then the war was starting to end down, and I was sent there at the end of 43, and I was in charge of 30,000 plants that we converted from military to civilian production. I think Sioux City had what? Western Wind Charger. I closed that plant, I remember. Omaha had what plant was there? An airplane plant. I closed that one, among others. Well, then I finally got out in 46 and came to Lincoln, because the kids were growing, and I wanted a Jewish connection. And I became very active in Lincoln. And very quickly, you'll find it in my file, I became president of the Boy Scout Council, because I got interested in the kids became in the Scout movement, and we all became first class together, Eagle Scouts together. And then I became president of Kiwanis. I was the first Jew to be in Kiwanis in Lincoln, Nebraska. And I became their president. And we were one of the best Kiwanis clubs in the country. I'm not bragging, I'm just telling you facts, because I had something to prove. And then I became eventually potentate of the Shrine. I was president of the Symphony. I was president of the Lincoln Community Playhouse, where I performed in at least 10 shows. Got their Best Acting Award a couple times. I was on the board of the Chamber of Commerce. The Jaycees awarded me the best young man of Nebraska. I don't remember the year of that. And that just about does it. I keep busy because I belong to so many organizations.
Talk about your first trip to Israel.
Oh, my first trip to Israel. Betty and the kids and I went in 1952. That's just a couple years after the independence. And my dad had a twin brother who was in Israel. He was a religious man, very religious, a wonderful guy, and he had 4 children. So we had 4 cousins from the twins, us and them, and they were wonderful. Just, we got along beautifully, and they all spoke English, except Chaim Shmuel, my dad's twin brother, my uncle. He didn't speak English, but we got together in Yiddish. And I don't know what you want me to say, but one of the stories is we were there on a Shabbos, and I said, I want to ask you a question. Because that time I was president of the synagogue here. Incidentally, I was president for 6 years, at which time we built the present building. And I raised the money. Alone. Raised it all. But anyway, getting back to that Saturday, I asked my uncle, I said, I want to ask you a question. He said, if I don't have to argue. All this in Yiddish. I said, you know, I'm president of the synagogue, and it's Saturday, and we have a heavy snow. Now, we have 9 people. The rabbi can't get there because of the heavy snow. Can we go and pick him up in a car? He says, no. I'll never forget that. But he was a sweet man.
Leo, I'd like to hear how your father got started in the metal business. How did he happen to do that?
Okay, that's a good question. As I understand it, when he first came here single, he became a peddler, and he got pots and pans and stuff like that, and went out into the country to the farmers and sold them. The story is that finally he had a horse and wagon, and they went out during a snowstorm, and the horse got caught in a fence and died. Well, he got out of that, and because Nathan Zolot, who was a kind of a relative, had started a kind of scrap biz operation. So on 9th and P Street here in Lincoln was the farmer's market, really. And I can remember that my dad went into that, and he became the owner. And I don't know, the State Historical Society, your society, has a picture of him in front of the old junkyard. And at that place, I remember that on P Street and on 9th Street, I can remember horses feeding at the troughs, horses and wagons on that street. And that had to be maybe 1916 and 1917. Now, of course, you wouldn't recognize it. But that's how he started.
I want to hear about the business then after you came along and got into the business.
Oh, well, during the war, my dad went into the smelting business, melting brass, brass. And then when I got out of the service, I went down to Topeka to the 832nd distribution center for the military, and they had what we called superchargers for sale, and I bought several carloads. I was a successful bidder, and these were basically aluminum. So we went in, and after dismantling them and taking them apart, we had a lot of aluminum. So we started melting aluminum and went into that business, and that's where I got into it. I was in charge of the aluminum plant at that while. At the same time, then Bob Cohn, my brother-in-law, married my sister, Selma. He came into the business, and then he was in charge of the smelting operation because he was a graduate engineer. Oh, before I forget, when we were at the university, 2 of my sisters were mortar boards. And Irving and Art Hill were members of the Innocents. Now, we were Sammys. By the way, I was advisor of the Sammy chapter for 16 years. And I was president of the Interfraternity Advisors Council during that period. And had a lot of fun because Dean Hallgren, who is still living, and we laugh about this now, told me that as president of the Interfraternity Council, I had to be sure that there was no drinking in the fraternity houses. Well, who was in the fraternity houses then? Guys who had just come back from Okinawa. And I'm going to tell them they can't drink. You know. But now we laugh about that. He knew what he was saying and knew that I couldn't live up to it. So let's go back to where I was. That's about it, I think.
Well, you know what I want to do now? I want to get Gary involved, and I want him to talk about the scrap metal business and the role you played. And you can probably talk a little bit about your dad then. And then, Leo, you can be thinking, because I'm going to get back to you about your supporting the University of Nebraska, the football team that's on. So that you think about. And Gary, let me hear from you.
Okay, I'll start mainly with the business. Starting at about age 11, like Dad did at a much earlier age at 7, would spend the summers working mainly in the iron yard. At that time, Northwestern handled all recyclable materials. We had magazines and newspapers, rags. It was the tail end of handling bones. Thank God I only did that for 1 year. We used to get the bones from horses and stuff that you would ship out. But I would then spend the summers mainly in the iron yard working under a guy by the name of Alex Miller, who came from Germany originally, and most of the crew at that time, scrap yards, more then than now, were the place that people that needed a start or a low-end job could always be hired. So within the scrap yard, we had many immigrants, several that spoke almost no English, mainly Russian, Lithuania. The aluminum and brass plants were filled with minorities. This is where the blacks would get a job that could build up to a foreman and above level. Within the structure, you had kind of a mini United Nations. My grandfather, Dan, and carried on by Dad, were about as color and ethnic blind as you could be at that time. Obviously, there are differences between then and now, but one of the first truck drivers, over-the-road truck drivers, that was black, worked with us, a man by the name of Ray Bott, Shorty. And I grew up with his daughter. We were at Lincoln High School together, and would go to dances together because of those times, even though Lincoln and the country was still segregated, Lincoln really wasn't. Lincoln had a very small black population, and prejudice only really gets bad if there are too many, quote, of them around and people get nervous. So Lincoln High was an integrated school, both socially to a great extent, as well as academically. But I would ride during the summers in the truck to Texas. We sold aluminum and brass in Texas and Oklahoma, and I would ride with Shorty. And as far as I know, he was one of the few blacks, and it was because of his personality, that was welcome in. We walked in doors that said whites only, and Shorty was welcome there, and I would go with him, and we would stay in the dormitories above at that time the truckers had dormitories above the rest stops. So it was a wonderful experience. But working within the scrap yard, I was mainly in the iron yard and the sorting and that. And then in the early 70s, after I graduated from college, originally I went from college into the Army in the early 60s. And during that period of time, I worked in the accounting and did a lot of the accounting within the operation because my background and education was business. Then the Army, and after the Army, I came back and worked within the operation for a couple of years, and slowly in about 1970, 71, Dad, I think to help train me, pretty much moved out of the active operation of the business. And so I ran it from 1970 on and off. Mainly the iron and the aluminum and the brass. During that period of time, we did eliminate the aluminum and brass because economically it wasn't feasible. The pollution equipment would have been too expensive and nobody knew if it would work. And in Lincoln, Nebraska, we couldn't draw enough scrap to be a factor in the market, so we were dependent upon what other people said we had to pay for it, and we were too far away from the end users, the Oklahoma and Texas and the rest, So the shipping made it very difficult. And so it wasn't economically feasible within that operation. At the same time, the city of Lincoln decided that the railroad that served us, and we had our own spur, should be closed because the train went across Cornhusker Highway. And so the railroad was eliminated. Well, a large scrap operation without a railroad is very difficult. You can work with trucking, and we did for many years, but again, the economy just isn't there. So slowly over a period of time, the scrap yard got smaller, and it just became to the point where a couple of years ago, it wasn't economically feasible to continue it. And so we closed the scrap yard down. But it was a wonderful business. The scrap business, when I came into it, was still one where contracts were made over the phone, and if no paperwork arrived and the price of scrap changed where one party or the other could lose a great deal, or it wasn't such a nice deal, you still had a contract. There was no discussion. The word was it. And if somebody said they were sending you something, that's what you got. Through my grandfather and my father, and most of the people of that era, it was a business of trust and of integrity. Currently, it's more of a business like any others, and people look at crossed T's and dotted I's, and so a lot of the fun has gone out of this scrap business also. But I think that's true of a lot of business. We were one of the larger family businesses in Lincoln as I grew up, and at that time, most of the businesses were homegrown and homespun. So decisions that were made civically in terms of building a new library, doing things for the improvement of the city, were almost like committee meetings. People talked about the O Street gang or a small group of people. Well, yes and no. But at that time, and very much in Omaha the same way, it was decision makers that were active within the community. Dad talks about the number of civic activities he was involved in. And my grandfather before him, though not quite as many. That carried through. It was normal that after I came back from the Army, I would be involved civically. It would be the Jaycees and the Masonic organizations and the Kiwanis. And by the time I was through, I'd been on the board or president of more than 50 civic organizations within the city, and you don't try to do that. When I was in the Army at Fort Leonard Wood, I was active with some of the civic groups there. I went in as a private. I was not an officer. I can say with great pride I was never a second lieutenant. And just only officers and soldiers appreciate
I think he's
that.
giving it to you, Dad.
But there in the Army, I ended up in charge of a training outfit. As an enlisted man, I moved up a little bit in rank. And so I was in charge of training for the headquarters company at Fort Leonard Wood. And the last about 6 months of my stay in the Army, I switched over to become an assistant to the first rabbi they brought in to Fort Leonard Wood. And so we built a small Jewish community there. We had several Jews. And St. Louis would supply us all of the goods, the wine and things we needed for Passover. My wife and I, with a couple of other enlisted men, would prepare the Seder for 600 people. And it was wonderful. We had a bar mitzvah there. The rabbi happened to be a Reform rabbi, and we had a bar mitzvah of a soldier that had to have been 18 or 19, that had not had the Jewish education before. The good thing about being Jewish then, in the Army, if you were part of working with the chaplain, I said we got wine and certain things that came from St. Louis. Well, at that time in the Army, there was a lot of trading going on all over. And so because of what I was able to get a hold of, anything we needed for our Jewish Community Center was a matter of very simple bargaining. And we ended up with a pretty good facility by the time Cece and I were through working with the Jewish part of it. Growing up in Lincoln, and I'm from the 1940s, so high school up through the early 50s at Lincoln High, there were about 8 Jews in my class and in the school. So we weren't a large Jewish population within the high school. Lincoln had a fairly nice Jewish population at that time, a large enough number. But we would have Hebrew school twice a week, and Sunday school, of course, and those hurt some of the civic activities, but they didn't kill them. We were still active. My brother was on the football team, I was on the swimming team and the debate team. We were able to do things actively, and most of the kids we grew up with, many that are now very prominent in Lincoln and in other communities, when we would talk about Jewish things, were interested and involved. I don't remember much prejudice against Jews. I know there were certain places in Lincoln we could not go, and we could not be a member of. It just wasn't done. But it wasn't the overt things that some of the others had. So we didn't have a great deal of prejudice. However, on the debate squad in college, when we would travel to small communities, 2 members of the university debate team that I was with were black. And we did go to places where they were turned away from restaurants and from public accommodations, and so the whole debate team got in the car and left and protested. When Cece and I were in the Army, we lived in a trailer court off post, and we invited our second lieutenant over for dinner one night, and he happened to be black. And the next day, we had some graffiti left in front of our trailer, and the management came and asked us if maybe we should consider leaving that area. And being a good active person whose grandfather was a socialist, who wrote great speeches, we immediately went to the base commander and started a protest, and shortly thereafter the entire trailer court was integrated. And it taught me that if you speak out, you do more good than if you're silent and walk away. And so when I was back in Lincoln, when it was time for Lincoln to form a Human Rights Commission in the early 60s, when things were heating up, I was on the first Human Rights Commission and was the vice chair. The chairman was Charlie Thone, who later became fourth governor and congressman. And Charlie, because of other activities that were coming up after a few months on the commission, had to resign. And so I took over as chair of Lincoln's first Human Rights Commission. And at that time in Lincoln, things like black doctors were not welcome with privileges at all hospitals. And they were concerned with lawyers and other things. But it was always somewhat quiet in Lincoln. The first case we had on the Human Rights Commission, and this is more for the historical perspective, the commission had expected, of course, would be a case dealing with black accommodations. It wasn't. The first case that we had, 2 men were in a bar on O Street, and they were talking, and they were not talking in English. And the bartender, who had come from Germany himself not too many years before, refused to serve them because in America you speak American. And so that was the first case that we had, and when we went, we tried a reconciliation process, and that didn't work. And we ended up in court, and I was the person for the Commission on Human Rights, and the judge, who had been around for years and was nice and friendly, ended up saying, well, the guy that ran the bar did wrong, but we're all good friends in Lincoln, and he'll let him in next time, so he dismissed the case. But human rights at that time was just really coming into its fold, and the Jewish community and individuals were as active as any, as I think was true throughout most of the country. During that time, the Lincoln Human Rights Commission, a couple of us were selected when they had the major disturbances in Chicago, to go to Chicago to help run their Rumor Central, a place where people could call in when they heard there was a riot someplace in town or something had happened. And so the Rumor Centrals were just to get the truth out which diffused a lot of situations. And later I was in Bed-Stuyvesant, New York, for the U.S. Commission on Human Rights that was less formal than it became later, to do some work in the Bed-Stuyvesant school area that was being closed and picketed for a number of reasons. So growing up in Lincoln and being active in Lincoln afforded some wonderful growth and knowledge opportunities. The one political story I'll tell has nothing to do with Lincoln, but it was something I learned in Chicago that I found interesting. When people would talk about Mayor Daley having all of this political power in Chicago, they like to talk about crooked politics and things that they did that weren't quite right. And I learned something when I went to Chicago with the Human Rights Commission. The head of the Chicago Human Rights Commission, who was black, I believe, was talking about the power of Mayor Daley. And he said, no matter what you hear about political power, I'll show you where it comes from. And about 4 of us went walking downtown, and it was 5 or 6 at night, and on the side of the street was a boy 4 or 5 years old. He may have been black, but it doesn't make any difference. And the head of the Chicago Human Rights Commission came up to this young man and he said, kid, who's the mayor of Chicago? And this 4 or 5-year-old boy said, that's Mayor Daley. And that's when he pointed out the power comes from knowledge that the people have of who's in charge, not all of the crooked things that you hear. It was an interesting lesson, and we see it in elections less today because of the power of the media, but it shows that things we hear are not necessarily the reality. Which now brings me to the trip to Israel, which in 1952 I was just coming up on my bar mitzvah. I was under 13 years of age. And Israel at that time was such a new country. My mother was very active in Hadassah, as the whole Lincoln community was. I think Lincoln at that time had more life members of Hadassah per capita than any city in the country, and I'm not sure if that still continues. So we visited facility after facility that were for refugees, youth centers, hospitals that were run oftentimes by volunteers, that were built in not fancy places. The Hadassah Hospital that had been cut off, which we couldn't get to up on Mount Scopus, we were able to stand behind the King David Hotel in Jerusalem and look through binoculars to where it was. From that same place, we looked across the barricades, and up above us on the walls of the old city were the Jordanian guards. We couldn't go to the old city. And in between was no man's land that was still fairly well devastated, and it wasn't safe. The drive from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem was a very fast drive because the drivers were still concerned about snipers and others coming in. They had the tin huts and the Ma'abara. The point is, that was 1952. That's not that long ago. And for people who have been to Israel lately, and I was there a couple of months ago, the modern part of the country, even though they're still going through turmoil, it's a miracle that was created that, as you look at other parts of the world, was not created quite the same way. The devastation after World War II was rebuilt. When we were in London before that, there were large parking lots from buildings that had been bombed that still hadn't been replaced. In Israel, within 4 or 5, 6 years, or if there's a terrorist attack even today, within a week or two, the place is rebuilt so they can show normalcy. The things that we learned from what they did with immigrants coming in, and you're talking people that spoke many different languages, some were educated, some were not. And Israel was a socialist mentality, but people were brought in very quickly and made part of the country. It was a wonderful experience, and we'll have for the society some 8mm movies of that time that we'll make sure they get. that show a contrast. So my point is that growing up in a pretty good condition, I didn't come from a poor family by the time I came along, and we traveled and we were active and we did see things. Growing up during that period of time was just a wonderful experience, and we had a good, strong Jewish community. We were not an Orthodox community, we were conservative, which meant within the synagogue we had a little bit of Reform, though there was a Reform temple in town, but also a very strong group of Orthodox. And I would go with my father to the Minyans almost every morning, and there would be great discussions. I would call them arguments at the Minyan over the reading of the Torah, or at that time at the end of the service. Oftentimes they would have a shot of whiskey, which was traditional. But the man in charge of the whiskey, where it was locked up, if he didn't feel like a drink of whiskey, nobody had a drink, and then the arguments would go. There were wonderful characters and wonderful times, and always a sense of community within it. The kids I grew up with are now spread throughout the United States. One is a rabbi in Israel, who was one of their first conservative rabbis, Michael Gretz. And we still keep somewhat in touch with each other, some of us more than others. And we talk back to those days. The Jewish education that we had took more on some than on others. Obviously, Mike's a rabbi. I would never be confused with that. But the education and the background and the concern of the parents was there. And we grew up in an era where if a Jewish person had any type of a simcha or any type of a less pleasant experience, the entire community showed up. There was no question that the synagogue was filled for a bar mitzvah, not just the friends and some of the non-Jewish friends, but the entire community was there. And the lunches were in the synagogue, and it was the women that cooked. We had our men's club. Because the times were different, and because maybe there were certain other things we couldn't do within the community, there was a great sense of community within the Jewish area.
You going to talk about your JC experience yet?
Okay.
I'll tell you what I want to do. I want to go back and hear about your experience as a booster at Nebraska.
Okay.
And then, Gary, I want to come back and hear about the JCs, but I want to hear about your own family.
Okay.
Okay? All right, Leo, I want to hear about your being a Nebraska booster.
Yeah, I did forget, though, to mention that when I was in Rapid City, South Dakota, I put on a Seder that they'd never had in Rapid City. And the Historical Society has a picture in your archives that I sent them of that Seder. So you might think about looking that up. And then I did get out of the service. I am a retired colonel. Now, Nebraska football. I went to Nebraska football because of where our plant was from the time I was 5 years old. I can remember then later as a knothole that got let us see the games. And I was very close to Nebraska football, always. Well, when I came back from the service in 1946, we hired a lot of football players during the summer. At one time I had the entire first string in the aluminum plant. And we came very close to some of the football players. And at that time we were sponsors of football players, which was legal according to the NCAA. And every Sunday we would have some of the black football players at our table for dinner, as many as 9 of them. And we had some All-Americans, of course, at our table. Well, I think one interesting story is that Betty made kugel, potato kugel, and served it. And O.J. Simpson, who was a great...
Not O.J. Simpson.
Right?
Not O.J. Simpson.
No. Isn't that awful? He led the nation in touchdowns.
From South Carolina.
Isaiah
Hips.
Hicks,
Yes.
Isaiah Hip. He was with us for 5 years. And he liked potato kugel. So one Sunday he said, we have potato kugel next Sunday. And my wife said, if you score 5 touchdowns. He said, 5? But what happened was that he did score 4. But then in
Did
those
he get his
days-
potato kugel?
Potato kugel. He got potato kugel, yeah. Anyway, at that time I went to football practice every day because our plant was across the street at 9th and T Street. And this one time I went to Mike Corrigan station, who was the offensive coach. He said, hey, Hill, what's this kugel business? Because Mike was a great cook and also the coach. So I know the whole football team had heard about the kugel already. And I was very close. Since you went to every practice, and I was very privileged. When they had secret practices, I was right in there in the huddle. I knew what the game plan was. George Kelly, who was the defensive coach, with whom I became very friendly, used to give me the defensive signals. I could sit up in the stand and see him give the signal. Sometimes he was right, sometimes he was wrong. If he was wrong, they scored a touchdown. I mean, it's that simple, and a lot of people in the grandstand don't know what's going on the field. They don't realize that in 15 seconds they have word signals and hand signals on changing what they were going to do. They don't have much time, but we had enough talent to do that. My mother, ahead of me, never missed a football game, no matter what the weather. As a matter of fact, the Wednesday before she died, she was in the hospital, and we were playing Minnesota the following Saturday, and she was concerned that our boys wouldn't get hurt by those big guys from Minnesota. Incidentally, at her funeral, the athletic department sent a bouquet of flowers to her. And that's about the story of my football. This is the first year in 50 years I'm not going to practice because it's a little much for me to walk. But I've been asked to show up, even with all the secrecy. But I'm going to miss it this year.
But you will be at the football games.
God willing, I'll be there, absolutely. I didn't mention that through all of this, the university has honored me, and there's a thing up there that tells you that, of which I'm very proud. There's a couple other things that now I don't remember. Go back to Gary.
All right, Gary, I know, Gary, for a fact that you've been active in a lot of things. I mean, I've heard about you involvement, and I'd like to hear a little more about it, as well as about your own family.
Okay, well, my own family's relatively small. It's my wife, Cece, and me. When I grow up and reach maturity and puberty, then maybe we'll have children, but for the last 40 years, it's been the two of us, and we've been very fortunate because we have always worked together. We got married in college, and she was in the Army with me, of course. As a matter of fact, my wife's just under 5 feet, or it depends what day. She's either 5 feet or just under 5 feet. And so for me to get off for the holidays, the Jewish holidays, we were always very concerned that we wouldn't look like we were getting extra privileges as Jews at Fort Leonard Wood where we were. And to come off for the holidays, we would put in extra time and extra duty to make sure everything was done. I was a company clerk initially. And Cece used to come into the day room, or the office, and would do some of the typing of the reports and stuff. Now this was unheard of, that somebody brings their wife in to an army post to do extra work. But because of her height, they'd sit her on a couple of phone books so she could sit up and reach. So we had a good life together in the Army. Then when we came back, she went to work a few years. She was home, mainly doing civic stuff, and then she came to work at Northwestern. And so we've always worked together. Partly because of background, partly because of the Army, for a number of reasons. When I came back from the Army, I became active in the JCs with my father, Junior Chamber of Commerce, and my father was highly complimentary about, because it was an organization that taught you how to recover from mistakes. It allowed you to make mistakes and how to recover, and it taught leadership and several things that were wonderful lessons for me to learn. Because I had been away from Lincoln, people that grow up in a relatively small town can relate to this. And Lincoln was a small town then, especially the Jewish community. We were very small. Had I not left Lincoln for a couple of years, then I think I would have been a totally different person. Because you always are your father's son. You are the one that Mrs. Neiden pinched on the cheek all the time. You were a known quantity, and you were not a person per se. It's normal in small communities. Many of us understand that. Because I had been away and because it was the Army, when I came back, I was able to come back as a person and begin to make my own mistakes and do a lot of my own things out of the shadow, which is both good and bad, of growing up here all the time. When I joined the JCs and became very active, because I was taught as a kid, you don't join something if you're not active. And so everything that we did civically and business-wise, you did with everything you had. And so I became very active in the JCs and received some nice honors through the JCs and some other civic things. But one of the things that I was able to combine, at Northwestern, I indicated before, a lot of the people that you hired, these were beginning jobs. Several of the people that we hired came out of the penitentiary. That was not something I started. That went back, I think, to my grandfather's time, where people came out, and it was a place that they could get a job, and as long as they worked, there was no problem. One of the things I noted, because I was working in the iron yard with a lot of the guys, and then on the aluminum plant, on the job there were no problems. The work was as good or as bad as anybody else, and the dedication was as good or as bad. But off the job in the spare time, a lot of them had problems. What do you do with your spare time if there's no social structure, etc.? And so there'd be drinking and some other things, and it would lead to not good consequences. Because of what the JCs had taught me in terms of working and living and some other things, I started a chapter at the penitentiary of the JCs as a regular chapter, and it was something that was both unique and grew. At that time, the only things allowed in the prisons were, from outside of the prisons, were the Gavel Club, which was Toastmasters, and Alcoholics Anonymous. Other than that, prison walls were designed to keep people out as well as to keep the people in. And so the JCs was kind of a new socializing concept, not just for the inmates, but for the community. And people started coming in. And some other prisons around the country became interested in that. And at that time, our director of corrections, our warden, was Maury Siegler, who was a wonderful man and later a very prominent national leader in corrections. He arranged for me to visit prisons around the country to both see what was going on and to talk about what we did. And on some of the trips, CC went with me. While in the Army as a part-time job, I worked at an aviation company and ended up with my pilot's license, and so did some commercial flying for a while. So I was able to fly to a lot of the places around the country at a time when flying was okay. And it didn't cost you a lot of money to go into an airport, and not many regulations. And so we visited prisons all over the United States, And in the early 60s, what a lot of people don't realize, prisons in the United States were every bit as bad in some locations as anything they'll see in any other country. I don't care if it's Afghanistan or Iraq. The living conditions in Arkansas were with the wooden beds that you see in the pictures from the concentration camps that they were lined up, and inmates were beaten, and it was done publicly as a way of keeping control. So as I began to visit more prisons, I became more interested in things that might happen, and started a side nonprofit corporation that started working with inmates. And then later it switched to being a major information center, and after that we started doing work in developing countries as things got much better with prisons in the United States. So over a period of time, most of my work, both during the time of the scrapyard, which probably didn't help at last, as well as now, up to this current day, I work with prisons in developing countries and information centers here in the United States. And when you work with prisons, you get involved in other things. We, with a group called the National Coalition for Literacy that we helped start, we started a national literacy hotline where people could call in and either tutor somebody else or get help. And when amnesty, the first amnesty was given to immigrants from mainly Spanish-speaking countries, we were the clearinghouse for that. And in Lincoln, we were the only phone operation in the country at that time that had 24-hour-a-day Spanish-speaking operators along with others. Now every telephone hotline has that type of operation. We were one of the first runaway hotlines. In the early 80s, there were several homosexual murders in Texas. And as a result, politically, the governor of Texas, Briscoe, started what he called Operation Peace of Mind. And this was to have a place where people could call in, and it was a volunteer outfit run from a donated room in a Holiday Inn that the governor paid for the phone calls and the training. But people would call in and they would leave messages for their runaway children, hopefully to get parents and children back in communication. It was one of the first national hotlines of that type. With the JCs, because of my work in prisons, I was called to a meeting to see how we could advertise that to other communities. And while I was in the meeting with the governor, I asked him if somebody that they talked to, a kid said, "We need help. You know, I need a place to stay. I have no money, whatever, or I need transportation back home," what did the operators tell him? And the governor and his head of the volunteers at that time said, "Well, we don't. We just take messages to pass to parents. We just don't know what to tell them." I said, "Well, that shouldn't be too hard to arrange." And he said, "Can you do it? Can you put it together?" And I said, "Of course, that shouldn't be too hard. Give me 2 weeks." And I left the meeting and I got on the phone and I called CC in Lincoln, and we had a staff at that time of probably 8 or 9 people in our National Clearinghouse for Ex-Offenders, because we helped them with jobs and stuff. And I said, "Could we do this by phone for any kid that calls in?" And they said, "We don't know." So I came back to Lincoln, and in about 2 weeks we gathered enough resources from around the country, just gathering from long-distance operators from groups that work with prisons, that 2 weeks after we met with the governor, when a child called Operation Peace of Mind and said, "I need help," we were then called by the telephone operator, told what the kid needed, or we were plugged in directly after that, and we provided resources. Now, of course, an outfit like Boys Town, which is wonderful, has this whole national complex, but I'm very proud. We were one of the first to think of, if you've got somebody on the phone, provide help. And what we did was, when we weren't in our office, even though we were 24 hours a day, there were 4 or 5 of us that had telephone beepers donated to us by the Lincoln Telephone Company. And that was before beepers were a big thing. And if CC and I were on duty, and we had the beeper with us, one time I was on my bicycle riding home, and I had the beeper and it went off, and I stopped at a telephone booth, and it was a kid that needed in a job or not job, housing or emergency care, whatever. And we had a process. Then we could oftentimes call the long distance operator. That's before everything was recordings. And one time, one of my favorites, to give a flavor of what the country was like then.
Well, welcome back.
We had a individual who was in a small town in Kansas. Kansas or Iowa, doesn't make any difference. And he called and said he wanted to return home, but he was a little nervous and he needed a place to stay. He was on his own on the street. And so we got the number of the phone booth he was calling from, because we would call him back. And they could call us collect, because they had no money. And we got on the phone, and first we looked, and there was nothing in that town, in a little tiny town. So we got on the phone and asked the long-distance operator, is there anything in town? Give me a name of a church. Well, there was no church in that town, and there was obviously no cell. There was nothing. It was a town of maybe, I don't know, 25, 30 people. So I said, call any number in town. And the first two, there was no answer. Third number, a young man, or a man answered. I don't know if he was young, and I told him what we were doing and who we were, and this was the operation. We need a place for a kid to stay just someplace safe until we could work out transportation. And the bus companies would give us free transportation, or trucking companies. And he said, well, I'm the sheriff, and I can find a safe place for him to stay, and it won't be jail. I said, well, if I tell this kid to call you as a sheriff, he's not going to do it, and he's going to keep writing. So I tell you what. He said, tell him to call this number, it's my daughter. And I will tell her where to tell the kid, and he'll probably stay with her overnight. He said, we won't arrest him. It was a different era. There were different dangers maybe and different perceptions. So we were able to call trucking companies and ask them if they would send a kid like freight, only let them sit up front with the driver, and they would go all across country, from one truck to another, and all we did was help organize them. But it was an era in the country where people wanted to help and make things right. And I think that the desire's still there. The situation's a little different. Because of that and a few other things, Reader's Digest did a story on our operation and on me. That was a major one, and this was November of 70, or no, about 76, 77 or 80, something like that is when 1987 is when Reader's Digest came out with their story. We still, and this is 2003, we still get one or two calls or letters a month from that Reader's Digest story, now from all over the world, because Reader's Digest goes from the living room to the bathroom to the doctor's office, from people wanting help. And it was basically this idea of referral, and we're still able to provide it. But it's interesting. If people are asked what to do and given a little help and security, finding resources is not a problem. And so now, a lot of what I do internationally in developing countries, mainly with prisons, with others, is that same concept and same work. And it all came because of the scrapyard and the philosophy and the Army and a few other things.
I have two things that I didn't mention. One was that when I was with the 307th Bomb Wing here as an active reservist, I went up to Thule, Greenland for a couple of weeks during Rosh Hashanah, and we had service, and we were proud of the fact that we were probably the furthest north synagogue on Rosh Hashanah in the world, because that's near the North Pole. The other thing is that when my wife got ill and we went down for treatments to Sun City, Arizona, and I got active there, I ended up as president of a Reformed temple. So I've been president of a conservative synagogue and a Reformed temple. That's it.
Leo, with all the experiences that you've had in life, Is there a message that you would like to leave for Gary and for everybody else for that matter?
My dad taught me that you're put on this earth for one reason, to make it better. And that's my philosophy.
And Gary, is there anything specifically that your father has instilled in you?
You just heard it.
Well, I sure appreciate having spent this time with you two.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was fun.